Revelation chapter 2. So we're talking about the churches and the foundation again. One of the wonderful aspects of the book of Revelation is in chapter 1, verse 19, we have an overview of the book of Revelation. And I know that some of you are probably thinking, okay, we've got our kids here, what are they going to gather from this book of Revelation? You might be surprised what they gather. Keep asking them, hey, so what about this? Or listen, or have them tell you something that they've remembered. And they will. There will be aspects that they'll remember from this. So one of the things that we've been talking about over the last few weeks is that the book of Revelation is very chronological. It's very orderly. And in verse 19 it specifically says, write down the things that that specifically are, or that you've seen, and then the things which are, and the things which shall be hereafter. So the things which are seen are what was in chapter 1. That was when John saw the Lord, and we had all the descriptions of the Lord there in that chapter. And those descriptions of the Lord are significant because we see them again validating the nature, the person of God, and the description of Him to each individual church. There will be certain aspects that will be shown in that particular church as He speaks to these 7 churches. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But write down the things that you've seen. So that's chapter 1. And then the things that are. And it's present tense. And He's speaking to the churches. And He speaks to these 7 specific churches in Asia Minor. Beginning with Ephesus. Remember, Paul has been on the he's been exiled on the island of Patmos, and so the Lord is speaking to John, and he has a message for each of these 7 churches, beginning with Ephesus, and then Smyrna, Pergamos, and it goes in kind of a circular manner. It begins at Ephesus, it kind of moves on up to Smyrna, and then Pergamos, Thyatira, then it starts to circle back down a little bit over to Sardis, Philadelphia, and then Laodicea. So in a sense, you can almost see that it's complete, even in the manner in which the message goes through. And the aspect of this being that it goes in this order is very important, because we end up seeing that these churches that the Lord is speaking to are not only churches that were existent at that time, but they're a picture of the characteristics that are going on in those churches are characteristics of the church during any period of time over the last 2,000 years. In other words, as we look at the characteristics of Ephesus, we saw last time it was the backslidden church, or the church that was strong in the works of the Lord, but they had fallen away from their first love. They weren't in that relationship with the Lord anymore. And then we come to Smyrna, that we'll get into, and Pergamos. All of those 7 churches are represented throughout the history of the church. But then the thing that's really interesting is that as we look back over time, especially right now, being at the latter time of this, in the last days, what we end up discovering is that the order of those churches also speak of the historical chronology of the church and the things that have been primary characteristics of the church during the church, the age or the time of the church. So it's very fascinating. Ephesus represented roughly the 1st century, or the 1st century and a half. And then we're going to get into the church of Smyrna, which of course was a church in Asia, but as we continue through, we'll see that it also represents a time frame from about 150 or so AD into about 313, or early 300s AD. And so it becomes very interesting. And then Pergamos from early 300s AD on into, and it just continues through. So it's a very fascinating thing to see, and we can recognize that in hindsight. So if those churches had been discussed in a different order, it would have had a totally different meaning. Now, it might have had a different meaning, the Lord would have had his purposes in it, but the order that it went in gives us a very specific order of seeing how the church has continued from the first century until today. And we see also that with all of those churches, and specifically the last four, they are the ones that come right up to that 70th week of Daniel. You remember the last week, the last 7-year period, that they come right up to that. So it's called the tribulation. It's a tribulation for Israel. It's the tribulation for the church. Those who are, I should be more qualified in that, it's the tribulation of those who receive Jesus Christ during that period of time, because the church is raptured before then. And it's also the time of God's wrath being poured out upon the world. We are right there at that spot where the rapture is ready to take place and the wrath of God is being poured out upon the world. The tribulation, the time of Jacob's trouble, is going to be happening upon, with Israel. And people who believe during that period of time are going to go through some difficult times. Tribulation, for sure. And it's not that there's not tribulation taking place up to that, but when Jesus is talking in Matthew chapter 24, after what we know, the abomination of desolation, do you remember that? This is when, during that 7-year period, there's going to be an antichrist, or somebody who's going to be a world leader, who's going to come on the horizon as like a Messiah figure, and yet there will be a new temple rebuilt, and he'll go into that temple in Jerusalem and basically proclaim himself to be God. And from that time to the end, Jesus actually calls that the Great Tribulation upon Israel. It's not like there's not tribulation before that. But this is the Great Tribulation that's being poured out, and the great difficulty for Israel during that period of time. So, all of that said, the churches, as we talk about them, they're butting right up against that last 7-year period. And so that's where we're at right now. It's just right there, just before the rapture, just before the harpazo is the other. That's the Greek term, or it's the being caught up. And the thing that's interesting is the chronology of the book of Revelation tells us that, right, the things that you've seen, Jesus, chapter 1, the things which are, which is the churches in chapters 2 and 3, and then we come to chapter 4, and we see a word there called hereafter, or after these things, some of your translations would say. But 9 times throughout the book of Revelation, there's this phrase, hereafter, after these things, which in the Greek is meta tauta, after and then things, that they each mark a point in time to show us chronology moving through the book of Revelation. It's very fascinating. And it also tells us that it implies that it's understandable, it implies that it's orderly, it implies that we can see these things and understand them. So in chapter 4 through to chapter 22 of the book of Revelation, the things which will take place hereafter, meta tauta, the things that will take place after the church. So everything that we see there in chapter 4 to chapter 22 are things that take place after the church, what we understand right now. And it's interesting because even in chapter 4, we'll get to it, but John is caught up himself. He's caught up in that same word, harpazo. He's caught up into heaven to begin to see this revelation unfold before him. So right now, we're looking at the epistles of Jesus. We have the epistle of John, we have the epistle of Peter, we have the epistles of Paul. These are the epistles of Jesus Christ, specifically to the churches. So as we continue on through, that's our background. That we talked about the church of Ephesus last week, and that was the backslidden church, the church who'd fallen away from its first love. Another characteristic that we see in these messages to the churches is that there's a pattern and design for each one of them. Jesus identifies himself in accordance with the chapter 1, some of its characteristic that, like today, we'll see that Jesus is the one with the sharp double-edged sword that was referenced back in chapter 1. And then there's a praise or a commendation. And for most of them, there's a rebuke. We'll find that with the church of Smyrna, there's not a rebuke. And then there's some counsel or admonition that comes from Jesus. And then there's a consequence of not heeding that counsel that they'll receive. And then there might be an additional remark, but then there's the overcoming promise that is given to each one of them. And we could see that in every letter to each one of these churches, and it's very fascinating. So we come to the church of Smyrna. And with the church of Smyrna, it begins here, and unto the angel of the church in Smyrna write, these things saith the first and the last, which was dead and is alive. So that's referencing verse 17 and 18 in the first chapter. But notice, this is Jesus, and he's saying to the church of Smyrna, I'm the first and the last, and I was dead and am alive, or is alive. That becomes significant because the church of Smyrna is a persecuted church. It's the church that comes after the church of Ephesus, I guess chronologically. So if you're lukewarm, then, and you're kind of falling away and you're not really strong in the Lord, you might be strong in God's works, but you're sort of lukewarm and backslidden, then the Lord might bring persecution. The Lord might bring trials to your life in order to bring you back to Him, in order for you to be saved, for us to be saved. J. Vernon McGee, I remember hearing him, I think I made reference to this last week, what's the greatest evidence of your salvation? And it's trials. Because with those trials, when we're tested, the question comes, do we run to Jesus or do we run away from Jesus? Do we stay with Him when we're like the seed that's found itself in that place where it's on the rock and it's it doesn't have its roots really strong? Some people, they just get burnt in the trial and they never recover. But others, they grow their roots deep because of those trials or because of the situation that can come, and they actually end up being stronger as a result. So if we look at the Ephesian church being the lukewarm, and the backslidden, fell away from your first love, then the next thing in line here are trials. And so Jesus says, I was dead and I'm alive. This is who's writing to you. I'm the first and the last. Now, the Smyrna itself, the root there of the name of that city is myrrh. And myrrh is an ointment, a spice, which is specifically used, especially in that time, for embalming or for, that would be in Egypt, but for the fragrance of somebody who's died. This is what would be brought. And this is why it was prophetic when gold, frankincense, and myrrh was brought to Jesus when, from the wise men of the East. They brought these gifts that were prophetic, and the myrrh was prophetic of the fact that he would die and be buried, and his body would be anointed with these ointments. Again, it's in keeping with what is going to happen to Smyrna. But what's it say? I was dead, but I'm alive. And that's the hope and the encouragement that he gives to this church in Smyrna, is that they're going to go through some difficult times, but they're going to be okay, because they're going to raise from the dead. They're going to come back to life as a result of all of this. In addition to myrrh being used as an ointment for death and burial, it also has the meaning at the root of bitterness. It's bitter. It's not something that is, if you were to taste it, it would, it's a bitter herb. It's a bitter thing, which again speaks of death. It's not something, who comes away from death with gladness, even if we know that somebody has known the Lord and walked with them. There's a bitterness to that. There's a difficulty reconciling and working with regard to that death, it just hurts, and it's grievous, and yet we have the hope of salvation for somebody who's born again. So as a result, we look at this and we see the root meaning is bitter. Now, another thing that's interesting about this, just from a historical note, that even to this day, evidently, that the church that is there at Smyrna is the most Christianized, or the most Christian and widespreadly Christian church in what we know as Asia Minor or Turkey today. Which is fascinating that would be the result. That the church, of all of these 7 churches, the strongest one that's there is the one that's been persecuted. It's the one that, as I mentioned earlier, its roots are so deep now that even though the trials may come, it stays alive, and it keeps growing, and it keeps bearing fruit. So if you're going through a trial, then take heart, because the fruit will be lasting that much more, and it will come at times that you don't expect it to come. It'll be an awesome thing to see love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control at those times when everyone's just saying, I don't get it. I don't know why you have these things happening in your life when there's so much difficulty occurring. And this is why. Because it's the fruit of the Spirit, and it's because we're rooted deeply. So, as we continue on through this, we see that there's a praise and a commendation that comes to this church. Verse 9, I know thy works and tribulation and poverty, but thou art rich. And I know the blasphemy of them which say they're Jews and are not, but are of the synagogue of Satan. So, they have the works, they're going through tribulation, they're poor. They're not going through good things, and we can understand that. We may see this on the horizon right now for us, as we see our money losing its value and not having the access points to that money. We could have it, but it could be tied up. It may not be liquid. So this church is going through these trials and these persecutions and difficulties, and they're poor. They don't have the money, the access. They're just trying to get by. They have little bits of bread and little bits to survive on. But the Lord is with them. He's caring for them, but they're not a rich church. They're not a strong church. They're not a powerful church. But we find out that they are rich in a different way. That they're rich in spirit. And the Lord sees them as valuable, of great high value. So they're rich. And I know the blasphemy of them that say they're Jews and are not, but are of the synagogue of Satan. This is interesting. First of all, for us to understand that the synagogue of Satan, that there's this religious relationship to Satan and religion itself. And we need to remember that Satan is actually very religious. He doesn't have a saving knowledge of Jesus Christ. He doesn't have a saving relationship with Jesus Christ. But he wants us and entices us to get into a religious experience with the Lord. Into a religious experience, not with the Lord, but in things that are contrary to the Lord. Just religion, going through the works and the rote and all of that, without a relationship. And that's what Satan's goal is. What they're doing is they're holding fast to the Lord, and they can't do anything other than just meet and pray and go through the Word. Maybe they have to do it secretly. Maybe they have to do it underground. They have to, literally in the catacombs, they are underground with their worship. They have to do it undercover. And yet, they can't do the religious things, the things like, okay, I go to church every Sunday and it's at this location, and most people, still they don't have the side of here's the church, here's the steeple, open the door, see all the people, that sort of thing. They're not people-oriented, they're looking at steeples, and they're looking at buildings, and they're looking at the things that define the church based upon, crosses, and steeples and the iconic things. But truly the iconic aspect of following Jesus Christ is not an outward icon of like a cross, but it's the love of Christ upon each one of our lives. That's the iconic thing. That's what people see. They'll know that they're Christians by their love. So there are Judaizers at that point. They say that they're Jews, but they're not. These are people that are really into the religious, the tradition. In fact, somebody might even say, so what tradition are you? If they find out you're a Christian, of what tradition? And just say, I don't know anything about tradition. I just follow Jesus. It's not based upon any sort of tradition. It's based upon a person, of following the person. And yet, even here, we see that these say that they're Jews, and yet there's a disconnect. This is like what was going on with the Pharisees and the Sadducees. You remember, the two leaders during that period of time, sets of leaders, primary. And they were void of their understanding. They should have known what the Bible said. They should have known what the Scriptures spoke of, but they didn't. In fact, I was just reading in Matthew, I think it was Matthew 22, where the Sadducees, they brought that thing unto Jesus. They were trying to trick him. They said, okay, so they don't believe in the resurrection, but they came to Jesus and they said, okay, a man's married, right? And then what happens? That man is married, but then he dies, and so the wife is given to the next son or the next person, the brother, and then he dies, and then the next brother, and he dies, and there's 7 brothers for this one bride, and then then they bring this question to him. They say, whose wife is he? Whose wife is she in the resurrection? Now these are people that don't even believe in the resurrection, but they're trying to trip up Jesus. And Jesus is saying, his response is, you don't even know the Scripture. You don't even know the Scripture. And see, what we have here, there are people in Smyrna that are pretending to be Christian, pretending to be Jew, but they don't have a relationship with the Lord. And as a result of that, they don't know the Scripture, they don't know doctrine, they don't know anything about what who Jesus is in their lives. They don't really have Jesus in their lives, but they have all of the religion. They have all the outward markings of Jesus in their life. They have all the things. They may say, oh, well, God bless you. They may have the vernacular, the terminology down, but they don't have a relationship. So as a result of that, I know the blasphemy of them that say they're Jews and are not, but are of the synagogue of Satan. So he's letting them know, I know what's going on, and I know you're going through a lot of tribulation and poverty and difficulty, and I know your works. Through all of that, you're still serving other people and ministering to other people. And then we come to verse 10, but where normally we would have a rebuke, with the other churches, there's no rebuke for them. In other words, they're right on. They're doing the right thing. And in fact, there's only one other church that's like that, and it's the Philadelphian church. No rebuke, which we'll get to. This is the one that we would endeavor to be. This is the one. And yet we have the church of Smyrna, no rebuke. The admonition. And it goes on and it says, fear none of those things which thou shalt suffer. Behold, the devil shall cast some of you into prison, that ye may be tried, and that you may have tribulation 10 days, but be faithful unto death, and I will give you a crown of life. So, first of all, fear not. What's the admonition? Don't fear. Now, this is just for all of us to not fear persecution, to not fear. Do you remember not too many years ago, if you go to church and the COVID outbreak is going on, they're going to look for cars and with the license plates, and they're going to report you. And if you know someone, if you're a neighbor, you see that someone normally leaves to go to church, you follow them and get their license plate. Right? You remember that being discussed? Now, that never unfolded for us, but there was a fear of that. There was a fear and a concern. Why? Because we would be persecuted as a result. Fear not. is what the message is always given from the Lord, having to do with any kind of persecution. Any kind of persecution. Don't fear, trust. Don't fear, trust. And I'll add to that, don't fear and trust somebody else to be your advocate. But just don't fear and trust God. See, we've done that. I mean, certainly we've feared, and as a result of those things, and we've placed government in a position of advocacy. 9/11, it's probably the biggest debacle of all of that, or intentioned. I don't know. But the point is that, as a result of our fear, then we give up our rights and all of these things, and now there's more, laws and access to our public life than we ever would have wanted, but because of fear, we've said, well, I don't trust in God, but I do trust in chariots and horses. I trust in government. So I want the government to care for me. I want the government to watch over me. I want the government to take care of me. No, that's not what it says. It says, fear none of those things which thou shalt suffer. And it sort of implies, thou shalt suffer. Don't fear them. Fear none of them. And many times we just go on the assumption, well, if I don't fear, then I won't suffer. No, we may suffer. But still, don't fear and don't expect somebody else to walk us through or to be there. Jesus is the one that even if we lose our life, He will be the one to resurrect us. The government has no power to resurrect any of us, but Jesus does. Jesus has the ability to protect us and to care for us and to get us to, as we endure, to get us through the situation or to resurrect us if we perish in the midst of it. And in this case, that's exactly what would happen. Behold, the devil shall cast some of you into prison, that ye may be tried, and ye shall have tribulation 10 days. So the devil, that's his goal. He wants to throw people into prison because it shakes them up. If you go into prison for one day, they don't tell you that it's for one day. They just put you into prison. Or in jail. Maybe we'll put it in those terms. We generally don't know. So it's like we get all fearful and then we don't know what the outcome is going to be, how long it's going to be. The Lord knows the time. And specifically, He's telling them, look, it's only going to be 10 days that you're going to be there. It's going to be a short period of time. The number 10, what we see in a general sense throughout the Bible is that's a number of divine order. And what it speaks of is that you'll be in, when something is related to 10 days, 10 commandments, 10 plagues, even the tithe, that it's something that is according to what God's plan is. And so it's sort of like orderly and complete. And to know that, well, okay, if it's 9 days, that's not complete, that's not fulfilling all the order, but 10 is. So if He's saying to them, to us, that there's going to be tribulation 10 days, then that means that it's going to be a little bit tough, but there's an end to it. And God's going to accomplish what He accomplishes through that period of time. So that's good news. And for us to endure. But in addition to that, the fact that it says 10 days, there's also a prophecy here, because from AD 64 under Nero to Diocletian in AD 310, that there were 10 major persecutions that came forward from Rome. And so maybe that's the prophecy. Maybe as they're going through this last one, they know it's going to end soon. It's not going to go on forever. It's going to have a point of termination. And they could be encouraged with that. So the main thing, though, is they don't really know. What does tribulation 10 days really mean? We don't know. If we are told we're going to have tribulation 10 days, does that mean 10 days or just a complete number, or that we've got to walk through the whole process? The bottom line is it's God's process to complete us. Just like the 10 Commandments complete the law, that 10 days completes us in perfecting us through the trial and tribulation. And it completed them in that. It perfected them. as a result. So, as we continue, we see you have tribulation 10 days. So he says, be thou faithful unto death, and I'll give you a crown of life. He's saying, you know what, you're going to experience death, but I'm going to give you a crown of life. Would you rather not have the crown and live in this world right now? What would you rather do? Would we rather just live in this fallen world with all of these problems and with the sin nature and just continue to live another 5, 10, 15, 20 years? Or wouldn't it be better to have our lives abbreviated but then receive a crown of life that's eternal and to go on into eternity with Him? So, he that has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches, that he that overcometh shall not be hurt by the second death. And the second death is spoken of in Revelation 20, where after the 1,000-year reign, there's a white throne judgment. And all of the rest of the people who are not saved are resurrected at that point. They stand before the white throne, and if their names are not written in the Lamb's Book of Life, which they aren't, they won't be, then they bust open the other books. And in that other set of books, what do we find in it? We end up finding good intentions and good works, but most of the good works have probably been motivated out of a self-desire for recognition. They're not genuine good works. Many times when we walk somebody across the street, it's so that we'll be called the hero. Not all the time. But many times when we help somebody, it's because we want to get some sort of form of recognition for that. And even if we don't get the form of recognition here, we trust that we'll get that recognition by the Lord. Well, the rest of the dead lived not again until 1,000 years were finished. It's from Revelation 20. This is the first resurrection. Blessed and holy is he that hath part in the first resurrection. On such the second death has no power. But they shall be priests of God and of Christ, and shall reign with him 1,000 years. But then it goes on, and death and hell were cast into the lake of fire. This is the second death. And whosoever's name was not found written in the book of life was cast into the lake of fire. What else is in the lake of fire? Well, the Antichrist, the false prophet, and death itself. And then it goes on, but the fearful and the unbelieving, the abominable, the murderers, the whoremongers, the sorcerers, the idolaters, and all liars shall have their part in the lake which burneth with fire and brimstone, which is the second death. So this is the harsh reality of whoever has not received Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior suffers his second death. Lake of fire, where there's weeping, gnashing of teeth, outer darkness. It's spoken of a couple different ways and a couple different manners. So it's an amazing thing as it goes down. So I'm inclined to continue on and talk about Pergamos, but I'm not going to do that because I want to keep us short in here and wrapping up around 12 here. But what's the main takeaway from this? What is the main point as we look at this? That, first of all, to fear not. Fear none of those things which thou shalt suffer. You and I are going to suffer things in this life. The reason is because it causes our roots to grow deep. It causes us to draw close to God, to trust Him with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength. It's what solidifies, it's what strengthens those things. When we have this opportunity to come before the Lord and say, God, I'm going through difficulty right now. Now, God's not some sort of person that brings this on. As we see in the book of Job, what we have is a fallen angelic realm that's bringing accusation against God, that's saying, like Job, He's only blessing you because you're blessing Him. Give me a chance at Him and He'll curse you. And many people when they have that opportunity given to them, that as Satan makes their lives miserable, that they do curse. And that's what we see in the book of Revelation later on. We see the people, they have an opportunity to receive Jesus Christ, but then they curse God. They hate Him. They have an opportunity. They can be saved, but they curse God to His face. He's seen in the clouds. And they curse Him, and they assemble for battle against Him, and they'll fight Him, seemingly, and they will be destroyed. That's at the end of the book of Revelation, or toward the end of the book of Revelation, before the millennial kingdom is set up. Our president talked about Armageddon this week. You know what? Armageddon isn't until the end of the tribulation. And Armageddon isn't even where the battle's fought. That's the place, Megiddo, the valley of Megiddo. That's where they're all assembled to come. And then they are going to attack Jerusalem after, or maybe in line or in sync with that, the seventh bowl judgment that comes down. We're talking about at the end of the 7-year period. We are not in Armageddon now. We are not in the tribulation now, but we may have difficulties like Smyrna. Whatever the situation is, though, for us to understand, fear not, or fear none of these things. What things have you not walking with the Lord or not moving forward because of fear? What decisions are based upon your fears as opposed to based upon what God is telling you to do? What types of things are hindering our ability, your ability, my ability to move forward because I'm afraid of what the outcome may be? And that I may not even be willing to take that before the Lord because I don't want to reveal that fear to Him. What's that fear? Is it something having to do with your reputation? Is it something having to do with your financial portfolio? Is it something having to do with a relationship with somebody? Is it somebody that you're not getting along with that you know that you need to confront but you're afraid to confront? Fear none of these things, which thou shalt suffer. And know that the tribulation is only a short period of time. And to understand, as it says toward the latter part, you'll not be hurt by the second death. There is no hurt in the second death. We'll be raised before then. We'll have a crown of life given to us by the Lord Himself. A crown of life. Even if we should perish, a crown of life. So fear not. There's no fear in love. Perfect love casts out all fear, because fear has to do with torment. But see, all of that has been offset with the love of Jesus Christ. And that's what it really comes down to. So Lord Jesus, we thank You that You've shown us and given us